Today, roughly 80 to 85%, and this has been consistently polled for 30 years, favor some form of balanced budget amendment on the federal government. Most of the states are required to balance their budgets. The federal government is not, and this is the reason for $29 trillion in debt. And yet, the federal government will never impose a balanced budget amendment upon itself. Again, contrary to human nature, to limit your own power. Finally, today, 72% of the American public across the country, so that's a bipartisan number, say the federal government is too big and it does too many things. It's too disconnected from the American people. We may argue on a partisan basis about what should be done, what should the federal government do, what should it not do, how much money should be spent on one thing or another, but where we do not disagree as American people is we do not disagree on the idea government should do less and that those responsibilities should fall on the states. At the founding, there was a great debate between Hamilton and Jefferson, and most people are aware of this debate. Hamilton, the big government guy, Jefferson, the small government agrarian guy, and they argued about what was the proper size and scope of the government. Both of those founding fathers would be considered small government people today, and they did agree on one fundamental premise. They agreed on what they called exclusive spheres of authority. And that meant that it would be untenable, outrageous, uninhabitable for a country to possess two layers of legislative authority on the same subject. They actually believed that if the federal government could do something, had the power to do something under the Constitution, then states did not, and vice versa. They believed that if it was in the purview of a state, then the federal government should have no authority. Today, we have a multi-layered system. You have your own departments of energy and agriculture and protecting your environment. And the federal government has these things, making it impossible for the average person to navigate this quagmire of rules and regulations and laws. The question is, what do we do? We live in a very contentious time in American history. Seems like every issue is 50-50. Americans agree on almost nothing. Whoever ends up in charge of the houses and the presidency in Washington, D.C., 50% of the country approximately opposes, and vice versa. So what do we do about that? What is the cause and what do we do? I would argue, and I think this is borne out by circumstances, that the cause, the actual very cause of our strife in this country today is not politics per se, it's power. It's about a fundamental question. See, we argue about what Washington, D.C. should or should not do. What should be the policy on energy? What should be the policy on abortion? What should be the policy on education in our schools? And they love that argument in Washington, D.C. They all love it, both parties. And the reason they love it is because the underlying premise of that argument is that we should look to Washington, D.C. to tell us how to live our lives. The American people don't buy that premise. People in Kansas don't buy that premise. We've polled this nationally. Fully 2/3 of Americans nationally, this is on a state-by-state basis, say that it is time to call a convention of states and bring the power back to the states. And that's what we're asking you to do today. This particular resolution that we're asking you to vote on has 3 subject matter areas. It says that the convention may debate, 1, anything that imposes fiscal restraints on the federal government. That would include a balanced budget amendment. It would include maybe caps on taxation and spending. My favorite, it would include potentially imposing generally accepted accounting principles on the federal government. Most people don't realize this. Actually, the federal government uses no accounting principles. I've sat with officials at the Congressional Budget Office. They have no principles. They just decide how they want to account for things. So we need generally accepted accounting principles imposed. Number 2, it could discuss anything that would impose term limits on federal officials. Notice I didn't say Congress, I said federal officials, because the problem is broader. We all understand the problem nowadays of the deep state of bureaucrats who are unaccountable, unelected. And again, this is nonpartisan. These are people who get into positions of authority, who are making the rules and the regulations. They're serving as rulemaker, as judge and jury on the prosecution of regulations, and they're not accountable to the American people. They are not elected. So we can put term limits on Congress. Yes, 80 to 85% of Americans believe we should do that, but also on the bureaucrats, on staffers, and also on the judiciary. And I think all of those things are important. The third thing is anything that would impose scope, jurisdiction, or power restrictions on the federal government. This is where we get into enumerated powers. This is where we're trying to bring the power back to the states, the power back to Kansans. Kansans elect you because they trust you and they believe in you. regardless of your party. Polling shows overwhelmingly that state legislatures have favorable opinion ratings among their constituents, while Congress, they're kind of below coronavirus in their favorability ratings. It's absolutely incredible. So your constituents want you to have the power, and the founders gave you that power. They gave you an incredibly unique power. And when I say they gave you, I mean you in particular, you as state legislatures. They gave you the power to call a convention, to propose amendments, and to ratify those amendments. That actually makes you the most powerful people in the federal government. You don't learn this when you take office and you come and you get your orientation. They show you where the restrooms are, the cafeteria, maybe the legislative drafting office, the speaker's office. They don't tell you about your role in the federal government, that you have this unique power. And there's a reason they gave you that power. They gave you that power because you are them. You sit in the same the founders sat, and most of them sat in colonial legislatures, in early state legislatures, under the Articles of Confederation. They sat on county boards and county councils. And it's not that they thought that people who sat in those bodies would be better human beings, they understood human nature. It's that they understood that you would actually live among your constituents, that you would be close to your constituents, and thus more accountable to your constituents. Coming into a legislature like this, as I do every single week, reminds me of that. That I can walk into your office and I can sit down with you, that I see your constituents in your offices with you, meeting with you, that they talk about meeting with you out in the field. That's not true for congressmen and women. It's not true for United States senators. They have unique access to you, and this is what the founders understood, and this is why they gave you the power. I want to address one thing with all due respect about the 2/3 rules here in Kansas. I will tell you, generally speaking, they are unconstitutional. And the courts have ruled on this multiple times. You will hear otherwise from opponents of using Article 5, but this is the #1 treatise on the law of Article 5 written by Professor Rob Natelson. And so I want to read just a couple of quotations from this book. On page 38, it says, at the state level, legislatures and electors have often adopted state constitutional rules, legislation, and interstate compacts to manipulate the amendment procedure. Yet in a long line of cases, the courts have rejected those efforts. They are unconstitutional. By the way, the list of cases takes up half a page. It starts in 1813 is the first one, and it goes all the way to 1984 cases. So this is established law and authority. Note, this principle, ordinary legislation may not alter the amendment process. That applies at every step of the process: state legislative, application, ratification, proposal, and mode of ratification. This has been recently litigated in Missouri under Calzone versus Richard. And actually in this book, the Kansas Constitution is mentioned. It says it follows, and this is on page 39, in the Kansas Constitution, Article 2, Section 13, requiring a 2/3 vote of each entire house to apply or ratify, it's not enforceable. And the Kansas Attorney General so ruled in an opinion, Kansas Attorney General 1910 on December 4th, 2019. You have the authority by simple majority to pass this resolution, to join the 15 states that have already done so. There are 49 states that have filed the application. 30 states have passed it out of committee. 23 states out of one house or another. 15 states completely. This year, expect a passage in between 5 and 10 states. We are going to have a convention of states, and we are going to limit the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government, and we are going to return it to you. The question that Kansans are going to be asking, there are over 30,000 of them that have signed the petition here in Kansas, they're going to be asking, will Kansas stand and make its voice heard? Will the Kansas legislature represent the people of Kansas in saying, enough is enough with the federal government, we want to restrain their power, and we want you, the Kansas legislature, to have that power? I'm here live in Philadelphia at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. When you hear the phrase lives, fortunes, and sacred honor, these are the folks we should think of, those who anonymously gave their lives. Well, today you have a chance to volunteer. You need to volunteer for conventionofstates.com, the movement that's going to save the country. These folks are willing to step up and give everything. We need you to give just a little bit. Go to conventionofstates.com and volunteer today.